Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Black Film Supremacy Film Festival of 2021, where the theme is climate change and environmental awareness. My name is Destiny Hodges, and I'm the founder and co-executive of Generation Green. I'm the assistant producer of the climate podcast, The Coolest Show, a senior at Howard University, and an inspiring filmmaker on environmental liberation throughout the African diaspora. I'll be moderating this panel discussion of the histories of displacement block today. We have with us Morel Doucet.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So my name is Morel Doucet, and I'm a Miami-based artist and educator. My work examines the realities of climate gentrification, climate change, and displacement within Black communities in South Florida.
Thank you. We also have with us Adrienne Chadwick.
Hi, I'm Adrienne Chadwick, and I'm an artist and art administrator working in South Florida. My art focuses on power and resistance in society and nature, and I'm representing the film Art and Environment alongside Morel Doucet.
Thank you. We also have Liz Kennedy.
Hey y'all, really happy to be here. Thank you, Destiny, and to the entire Black Femme Supremacy Film Fest team. Yes, my name is Liz, and I am here today with Led to Life's newest ritual film, Between Starshine and Clay. I'm an artist and environmental justice organizer based out of Detroit, occupied Wawi Watanong, Anishinaabe territory. And yeah, my work is to queer systems of oppression through joy and ritual and abolition, Black feminism, and relationship to the more than human world.
Yes. We also have with us Ariella Aïsha Azoulay.
Yes, hi. Thank you for having me here. I am here for the film that I did recently about the plunder of objects from different places, notably from Africa, and the connection between the plunder of objects and the way that people's lives are being destroyed and being made vulnerable for further imperial violence.
Wow, thank you for all being here with us today. As everybody can see, we have incredible folks and incredible films that we're going to talk a little bit about today. So I want to start with some general questions for everyone. You know, we often read the descriptions or watch films and construct our own analyses, but since we have you all here today, let's hear from those involved in the creation of the films. What is your film about, and how does it connect to this block of histories of displacement? I'll start with Liz. You can tell us.
Awesome. Thanks, Destiny. So yes, I am really excited to share with y'all the newest film from Led to Life. It's called Between Starshine and Clay, which is a line from the Lucille Clifton poem, Once You Celebrate With Me. And before I share a bit more about the film, I'd just like to introduce Led to Life's practice. So we are a translocal collective of Black diasporic and queer artists, healers, ecologists, devoted to embodying Mark Anthony Neal's prayer that Black wellness is the antithesis of state violence. So we bridge racial and environmental justice through ceremony and what we call applied alchemy, which is wielding alchemy to provoke radical imagination towards justice. So Between Starshine and Clay is part archival footage from some of our ceremonies. We actually collected guns back from the city of Oakland and worked with a team of welders to melt them down into stars. So a literal practice of alchemy in ceremony with the entire Oakland community at the conclusion of the anti-police terror at the end of the March to Reclaim King's Radical Legacy, which is an annual march that happens on MLK Day in Oakland, hosted by Anti-Police Terror Project. So we melted guns into stars, the constellation that's shown above Oscar Grant, who was a young Black man who was murdered by BART police 12 years ago. So Between Starshine and Clay is images of that ceremony juxtaposed with footage that we shot in February of 2020 alongside two mothers, two warriors for justice, Dion Smith and Denise Hall, two women who have lost their sons to police brutality. And we created ceremony with them alongside folks from various Afro-diasporic spiritual traditions, Ifa worshiping traditions, to really offer those stars that we had alchemized together back to the earth. So that is what Between Starshine and Clay is about. It is a love letter to Blackness, to soil, to salt, to the healing power of alchemizing our grief and community and ceremony. It's experimental, it's speculative, and we like to say that it's a ritual. We shot it in ritual. We were in ceremony the whole time. And I think when you're working with themes of Black trauma and Black death, it can feel very voyeuristic. So we really wanted to shield our community and those who were generous enough to share prayerful space with us in that way from that. We don't want it to be voyeuristic. We're asking folks to witness this alongside us and kind of redistribute some of this grief. So yeah, that's Between Starshine and Clay.
Wow, that's powerful. I think your description really, really encaptured just the power of what was going on in the film. Let's go to Morel and Adrienne. What's your film about, and how exactly does it connect to this block of Histories of Displacement?
I'll let Adrienne go, then I'll add some support.
Okay, sounds good. Well, our film Art and Environment was produced by the African Heritage Cultural Arts Center in Miami as a part of a resiliency project that was county-wide in Miami-Dade County. It was shot by Serge Doucet, and basically the film features Morel and myself as artists, practicing artists in South Florida, Miami area. And both of our art practices are focused on environment and displacement, climate gentrification. And so the film basically kind of goes through both of our practices, and we talk about issues that we have in South Florida and the African diaspora and the Caribbean. Both of us are of Caribbean descent, and we here in South Florida in the subtropics, we see firsthand what happens when the king tide comes and the water is literally in people's front yards because the sea level rise, we could see it happening, or flooding in our neighborhoods, or when hurricanes come through, or all these volcanoes that have happened this summer in the Caribbean. So yeah, that's basically what our film is about.
And then to kind of piggyback off of what Adrienne just said, so when it comes to the issue of climate change, South Florida, we're practically ground zero. We're gonna experience climate change probably first out of many of the other states when it comes to the ocean coming up. And so for us, we felt it was very important to bring agency and bring awareness to what is going on. When myself and Adrienne, when we're in different spaces, there's not many Black and brown folks. The spaces oftentimes are very white dominated. And, through experience and talking to other people, it's not that communities of colors don't care about being in these meetings. More than often it's because they don't have the luxury of being there, because they're trying to put food on the table. They're trying to, take care of the kids. They're trying to take care of the family. And so as artists, me and Adrienne are using our platform to disseminate this information. And in particular, myself and Adrienne, we use ceramic in our work. And ceramic as a medium, it interlaces human history and time. Is the only medium that really, it looks at the archaeology of human history, the economics of human history. And so as a medium, there's this magical realism quality to it. And so in the film, there's this connection that happens between my work and Adrienne's work. And Adrienne does a really beautiful job talking about the redlining that is very prevalent in South Florida as well. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank both of you. Of course, Florida surrounded by three sides of water, as you mentioned, being one of the first places to really experience climate change consistently as it impacts the U.S. or even the global North, I would say. And I think it's very interesting the use of art in your film to really bring to life, as you said, and give agency to folks that are experiencing it first and foremost on the front lines, and that often don't have the ability to be in these conference rooms, as you say, of these big greens or organizations who have the money and resources to be making decisions. So thank you for that. Ariella, what about you?
Myself? Okay. Can you hear me? Good. Thank you. So I cannot tell exactly what the film is about, but I can say what the film resists. And the film resists in a certain way, this category that is called undocumented, that we hear about it all the time. And undocumented are considered by different, legal systems that goes back to 500 years of plunder. This category designate people as not having documents. And what are these documents? These documents are the documents that were defined by the different violent apparatuses that imperialism or racial capitalism put in place. And what I'm trying to do in the film is to show that those people that are being called undocumented, they have their documents in the form of objects in all the museums that surround us. So this is how I'm trying to connect together two movements of forced migration of objects and forced migration of people. That again, we see them along the 500 years since the quote unquote invention of the New World that came alongside the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from the Old World, quotation mark again. And actually what we see since the late 15th century, we see how people are being, transformed into slaves, being transformed into undesired population, their properties being expropriated from them. And slowly we see another movement where this property or these, objects, we cannot even call them objects. Sometimes these are ancestors, sometimes these are religious objects, etc., etc. These are being plundered into museums, and the action of plundering them and showcasing them in museums is a part of an attempt to see different cultures being vanished, being disappeared, no longer practicing not only their rituals, not only their ceremonies, but also being protected by those ceremonies and by these objects. So the film shows only objects that were taken in different European museums. And there is a voiceover that I wrote, and three incredible women sing it or vocalize it, Edouard, Auri, and Mo Mother. And the film was shot by Bonabel, who passed away last summer. So I consider it now as an homage to Bona, with whom I worked on this film.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you all so much. I was going to ask another question, but I think you all kind of touched on it, in terms of what is your identity and how do you show up in this topic of work? But I think you all absolutely touched on that. And I really, really appreciate it. So I want to move to some questions touching on each film to give you all your flowers and your spotlight. So let's start with Between Starshine and Clay. The title of the film is embodied in the beginning with the person who appears to be, as I'll say, awakening from the earth or the dirt. And in the end, the star or a sun, as it could appear to be, symbol is buried. What do the elements featured in the film represent? There's dirt, there's air with the smudging that was taking place at the action that was filmed. There's incense, there's fire with the candles, and the water as we see with the ocean, and much more. So what do these elements represent in the film?
That is a great question. So first, I'd just like to shout out our creative director, Broncy Velez. That's who you're seeing kind of rising from the earth in the beginning. And it is also their words, the Well Prophecy. That's the poem that you're hearing throughout the film. When I was like introducing Led to Life's work earlier, I talked about what we call our practice of applied alchemy. So we're literally melting guns down, which is a very corporeal, kind of like tangible process. And in our practice, we actually have an opening and closing ritual that we read together every time we meet, every time we hold ceremony in any way. And one of the things we say in our opening ritual is like, the guns came from the earth, right? May we return these elements back to the earth as a gift. So when we think about guns, it's lead, it's iron, it is molecules that come from the earth that have been deformed and transfigured into tools of violence. So we think a lot about, okay, we manipulated the earth to create these tools of violence. How can we alchemize them to actually create a tool of healing instead? So that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of focus on earth-based materials, the soil, the salts, the incense, the air. We want to make this really tangible. We also want to make Black grief really tangible. I think in our communities, we're grieving in isolation, and just in our culture in general, we've lost so many of our collective grief practices. Of course, the history of enslavement had a big part to do with this. Drums were banned, ring shouts, homegoings were banned. I mean, there have been so many ways throughout our history on this continent that Black grief has been surveilled and policed and criminalized. And so we really wanted to bring this back to the public sphere and be like, no, y'all have to hold this grief with us. We all need to be accountable to the way that we are hurting the earth and hurting Black folks. And I'd like to quote Saida Hartman. She says, care is the antidote to violence. So we really want, these families to know that we're alongside them, that they don't have to grieve their beloved lost ones alone. And if you see in the film, there's animations as well. And like one of the animations is actually like zooming in to the molecular structure like of the gun. And our practice is called Led to Life. And it's a nod to the biblical lineage of turning swords into plowshares. So we are really thinking about this practice of like, okay, how do we turn lead into life? How do we turn violence into healing? And, earth and earth-based healing practices is such a core part of that, right? Like the earth longs to witness us in our grief. And we're not just holding the violence of white supremacy on our bodies and our communities, we're also holding the violence of white supremacy on the land. So there's like deep solidarity in holding these griefs alongside one another. So that's one of the reasons why there's like a lot of attention to like tangible earth-based cells and images and sights and smells. We wanted it to feel like really tangible, because what we're dealing with on the ground at the grassroots is not abstract. It's extremely violent and it affects every part of our waking lives. So yeah, we wanted it to feel real for folks.
Wow. I think that connects to all of the films, what you just said about elements. I believe it was Morel who said in the film Art and Environment that elements hold memories, particularly water is what he was speaking to. And objects, Ariella, hold meaning, hold power, especially when you were talking about, what was going on in the museums and our historical artifacts, or objects as they're called, but have many other names to us in our communities. Let's stick with that for a minute. So Adrienne and Marcel, tell us a little bit about the elements that you all use in your artwork and the memory that they contain, as Liz was kind of touching on and Marcel mentioned as well. Tell us about those elements that you use and why you use those particular elements. And then Ariella, you can also tell us about the meaning and the power and some of the objects that were featured in your film.
Morel, do you want to go first?
Sure. So for the last 2 years, I've been working on this huge ecological mapping in South Florida, where I go into Black and Brown spaces and I gather the flora and fauna in these communities, and then I then make portraits from these flora and fauna. And so what I've been discovering over these last 2 years is because of development, these communities are changing. We cannot stop it. But the only thing we can really document or have evidence of who lived there was the flora and fauna. The plants essentially become these gatekeepers of time. They hold the memory and the energy of that space. And so if I go into a neighborhood, let's say that was primarily the Dominican, the trees still going to be there. The bush is going to be there, but that house may no longer be there anymore, and it's been replaced with a high rise, with a condo. And so with my work, essentially, I've been finding that the organic material is what stays the same in those particular spaces, and that the people and community are being displaced and they're going to be gone. And then in addition to working with flora and fauna, I use a lot of ceramic within the work that I make as an artist. And so for me, ceramic holds this unique position where it has different properties that are magical realism. So when I think of clay, I think of Adam and Eve, the formation of man coming from the earth. I think of the Australian Aborigines and how clay plays into the stories of their creation in the dream time. And so land and earth, water and sea, those are tangible materials for me. And the people will disappear, but those elements will stay within the space.
So for my practice, I don't solely work in clay. I have been working in clay recently. Um, Basically, the artwork series that is focused on in the film Art and Environment is my Displacement and Resettlement series. It's a series of clay houses that I've made, over 600 handmade clay houses. They're about an inch or 2 inches each. They're not molded or measured in any way. So they're all slightly different. I try to get them the same size, using black earthenware clay for this series. And I'm talking about redlining, particularly in the Sistrunk neighborhood in Fort Lauderdale, which is a historically Black neighborhood. The piece was in The Porch is the Tree is the Watering Hole, an exhibit at the African American Research Library and Cultural Center in Fort Lauderdale. And I kind of, with that process, really started to look into redlining and gentrification and searching for histories of redlining maps in South Florida. And I found a lot in Miami, but also around the nation. And so that's what this work that's filmed focuses on. And clay, I love Morel's clay work, and so we were aligned this time around because I've been working in clay for the last few years, but I also work in other materials, any kind of found objects, plastic bags. I work a lot with accumulation and kind of creating a story based on accumulation of materials. So sometimes it's paper, sometimes it's clay or plastic bags, different things.
Yes, thank you. It's either the elements themselves or what we create from the elements, which I think goes directly to you, Ariella, with the objects that were or artifacts that were in the museums. So tell us a little bit about those objects, the power they have, what they represent.
Yeah, so my answer will be a little bit convoluted. You will excuse me. And listening to Liz Kennedy speaking about metal, I would like to connect my answer to this. So, I made this film and I felt like this is the first in a trilogy that I didn't do yet, the other two films. But the third one should be about where I'm coming from. Which I think that I am the oldest, in this panel, and I'm still asking this question because it is not as clear to me, even at my age. It's only in the last 2-3 years that I can could say that I'm actually coming from the nation of jewelers. The nation of jewelers that no longer exist in North Africa, the Arab Jews who were actually led or forced to leave North Africa, I think at the end of the 60s, right, in several waves, but at the end of the 60s. So when I did this film, the first one that is going to be screened in a festival, what I'm trying to do is unlearning, rather than what I'm doing outside of the film, and will be the third film in this trilogy, which is practicing muscular memory, trying to understand what are the practices that were not transmitted to me because I was shaped by 3 or 2.5 colonial projects. So the first one is 1870, when the French colonized Algeria. And they started to transform the life in Algeria and started to separate communities into communities that are homogeneous, while the Jews and Arabs were, one entity rather than two. The second one is I was born in destroyed Palestine, and I was shaped by the colonial Zionist project because I was born to parents who were on the Jewish side in these colonial projects. But the third one, which is meaningful for the film, is how we are being colonized by art. And the film is an attempt to unlearn the way that these objects, that we see them in museums, are being made available for us to learn them, to use them, to look at them, to be influenced by them, as if they were not actually emblems of violence, as if the violence that led them to those museums, we shouldn't look at it. So the film is about unlearning, and the film is a polemic film with a film that was done at the end of the 40s by Alain René and Chris Marker, who did this film called Statue Also Die, as if it is obvious that statue will die in museums, rather than saying the statue were murderers, or rather than saying that statue were threatened with assassination because they didn't die. They are waiting for their people. So rather than telling you anything about these objects that are not the objects that I have access to them, I have a direct access to them, what I'm trying to do in the film is to unlearn this access that we have to those objects. And in waiting for the third film, where I would be able to put together the idea that before being made part of the nation of the Jews or the nation of Zionists, for God's sake, that I do not belong to them, I belong to the nation of jewelers. And what I'm doing is practicing jewelry with found materials in order to revive this muscular memory that was not transmitted to me because of these 2.5 colonial projects.
Wow. I had to take a deep breath because that was a lot. And it was so beautiful and so deep and so thoughtful and intricate, which I think speaks to the work that all of you do outside of the films that you made, but within the films themselves. So thank you so much for that. I want to ask another question about, how these elements that you all use or pieces of the earth or the earth itself kind of transcend. And so, Liz, with Between Starshine and Clay, you mentioned the role of weapons and transforming them into what was showed in the film, kind of tools of commemoration. So tell us a little bit more about that process and the African spiritual systems that were represented all throughout the film. What is the role of those African spiritual systems and traditions in the film and in commemoration and veneration in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we work alongside predominantly Black communities that are really on the forefront of both police brutality and racial injustice, but also environmental injustice. So it's really important to us that we call upon different ceremonial practices from the African diaspora to hold this ceremonial work with us. And kind of what I was saying earlier in the panel, we're very attuned to this history of our grief practices, our ceremonial practices being lost in the violence of the transatlantic slave trade. Everything from, ring shouts, as I mentioned before, to memory jars, for example. Like, our people have had such we have such a long and rich lineage of honoring our dead and for ensuring safe passage. And because of the history of white supremacy, we've lost so many of these practices. So yes, you can see in the film, we worked with an incredible collection of folks out of Oakland. They're called the Oyanike dancers. At our ceremonies, we have Buddhists, we have rabbis, Thrive Choir, we had gospel singers, we had folks from all different types of, you know, religious practices in the diaspora, you know, Vodun, Ifa worshiping folks. We had like 3 altars, I think, at our ceremony in 2019. Yeah, it was important to us that, you know, when you do this type of work that does require so much trauma stewardship, you know, when we're asking mothers to literally offer these guns to the flames, it's extremely emotional, and it's extremely powerful. So it's like a part of our spiritual hygiene that we had to have the ceremonialists on deck. You feel me? So that's definitely a big part of it.
Wow. So I think I'm loving this theme of, and this was not planned. I didn't have questions pertaining to this, but this theme of elements particularly. So I want to hop to art and environment for a second. Especially, you know, talking about elements holding memories. And I think art, defining what is art, because I would even argue, of course, that these films are art. But I'd love to hear from you, Adrienne, and Morel. What is art? What is environment, and how do they intersect?
For me, I would say when it comes to environment, nature is a mastermind. You know, there's so many nuances from the way the leaf fold and bend, the way the palm trees sway in the wind. So nature is this architect that's genius, and you can't really replicate it. And then when it comes to art, art is, I guess, our body's response to the environment that we're in. Art looks different from culture to culture. You know, when it comes, you know, me being of Haitian, there's many things that are more ceremonial, and then in Western culture, they'll define it as art. And so I think it jumps from person to person, from culture to different culture.
I love that, Morel, because you know, that's always an argument in Western civilization. What is art? The Western culture always sees art as, you know, something that an individual has made, whereas different cultures see art as an everyday life. You know, life is art in many cultures. So I mean, I think the art is the environment, and the environment is art. And so yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I love that definition. I think, like, I remember taking a class, and the question, what is art, was just like this long thing of, like, you know, philosophers just sit and think on. And most of the times it really brings in like just the Western perspective of that. So I really, really appreciate your answers about art being life and living, and our experiences in response to the environment that we live in, that we're around. I think that's so beautiful. I hope more people adopt that definition of art. So I want to ask another question about using then art as in our lived experience or response in certain maybe isolated events to actually bring memories to life, or to tell stories, or even to advocate, or, you know, activism. So where's the connection there, which I think you all were definitely making when, you know, focusing in on a topic such as climate gentrification? What's the connection to showcasing the lived experience in an isolated instance through different mediums such as clay or whatever it may be? What's the purpose there, and how does that really work with storytelling?
So for me, people don't read. People do not read. People do not look at the data. They do not look at facts. We're coming from a post-presidency of alternate facts. And so when it comes to being an artist, the best way I found of communicating and disseminating information has been through imagery. And so as an artist, I recognize the power that I hold, and I have a responsibility to understand how I position myself and who I align my thoughts, ideas, or who I collaborate with. And so when it comes to the work I'm making, when the work Adrienne is making, ultimately those work has political ramification. They bring change, policy change, and again, and it has a bigger and faster platform to disseminate that knowledge. Like a film can reach people across the globe versus something that you're reading, people may not have access to it, or maybe people don't understand the language because it's so dense. So I think art it becomes this universal language that's not abstract. It connects back to the core and the feeling of the person, and ultimately it resonates and is universal.
For me, I mean, talking about art as a means or as a method to talk about memories and history, I think about my Belizean culture and how, I mean, in Western culture, we think of art as something that an individual has made to express some sort of idea, and I think about the art and craft of the indigenous folks in Belize, basket making and although, making a basket and teaching generationally how to make a basket, or our Garifuna culture in Belize making drums, I think those things do tell stories and do hold memories, because I mean, each weave and each pattern in a basket weaving is somebody's story, and the oral histories that it takes in order to share that knowledge. Like there's not written knowledge. Mr. Augustin Rodriguez, the Garifuna drum maker in Dangriga, where my mom lives, he doesn't have a written directions on how to make a drum. He has taught his daughter, the only female drum maker in my mom's town, how to make the drum. And he teaches people that come, to watch him underneath his thatch hut to make the drums. Like that's the only way. And so that medium and the making and the stories, all that holds the memories. And I mean, I guess I do think that it's that person's intentional kind of idea or concept that they're producing when they're making these drums or baskets or whatever it might be.
Wow. I think that speaks to how African traditions, communities, how we coalesce with one another, how we pass on information. It's often not documented because we have very oral traditions. Things are passed on through generations from elders. And Ariella, this speaks very much to your undocumented and Unlearning film about how these objects are documents, as you say, because they hold whatever the purpose was that they were created for, the power of certain communities, or hold a certain purpose, and how they were extracted, and how imperialism still exists, has not been abolished, and has barely, if at all, been recognized as an unpaid debt that still lingers. So tell us about some of the objects specifically that were featured in your films, or some of the types of objects that are featured in museums and the purposes that they have.
So if you will allow me, Destiny, I want to go back to something that you said about the classes that you're taking. They are mostly, centered on Western conception of art. And it repeated, I think, in what Adrienne also said about Western conception of art. And I think that we have to unpack this a little bit. What is Western conception of art? So first of all, when we read these documents, these kind of aesthetics or art history, we are actually reading the history of violence. But it is completely denied. It is completely silenced, because there is no Western conception of art without plunder. right? Without plundering cultures, from all over the world and organizing them like, in stairs, like, you say when they started, when they ended, and they often ended, they never ended, but they often ended in these stories when their objects were taken. So, and when we read, this kind of Western conception of art, we read a different conception that doesn't account for this violence, for this brutality of appropriating these objects, creating these kind of white cubes where you can organize them as if they came one after the other, but they didn't. They happened simultaneously. So this is one element that I would like to emphasize in relation to Western conception of art. We have to force this conception to live or to account for, or to be accountable for the violence that led for the emergence of this Western conception of art. The second thing that I would like to say is that Europeans who started all these expeditions of violence all over the world, they also destroyed their own culture, right? Because, European culture at the 15th century was not about showcasing objects, was not about individuals expressing themselves, right? So they had also to destroy their own culture. And just to give one example is the murder of hundreds of thousands of witches, right, in Europe. Of course, in other places, but in Europe, which meant the destruction of the culture of healing, the culture of objects, in order to make everything private property, in order to serve racial capitalism. So when we speak about, Western art, we have to hold it accountable for the crimes that let it be. And when we enter these museums that I show in the film, we enter museums that actually we see how Western art and other places are entangled through this violence. So the question is how we transform this violence, how we force this museum to disown these objects and let other communities not to restitute them to Africa or to Asia as if they are African or Asians only in Africa and Asia, how to let different communities to take over these objects that are theirs and to lead these museums to be something else than showcasing these objects. So I think that what we see with Western art is the idea of individuality that most of you already said, the idea of showcasing for others, and the idea that when you do art is not for your community, is for other communities. And I think that in your practice that you described, that really it was fascinating to listen to all of you, what matters is how you do it in your community. And the idea of art is how you destroy the communities where you showcase others' objects because you gentrify them, and how you train artists not to build the world in which they are living, but to create transportable objects that then will live in the market. So I don't want to relate to Western art as we read it in documents, but I want to relate to it as a history of destruction, including self-destruction. And without this accountability, without repair and reparations, we will all live under this, regime of violence. So this is what the film tried to do in 38 minutes, to let you see this Plunder as capsule of violence and to listen to the voice of these three amazing women speaking with their heart about this.
A word? A whole word. I want to go in on museums a little bit. One, I hate museums. So just watching that film, I was like, wow, if somebody could capture how I feel when I enter a museum, I think your film captured it. It's very eerie for me. Like I'll get nauseous. I'm really sensitive. And so all the pieces and often artifacts that are stolen, I feel them and I have to leave every time. So I don't go to museums that often. I've only been to a few. And there were some things that were said by the women who were speaking. There were three different women, if I'm correct, that were speaking. And in the pieces they were reading, they were talking about how museums are institutions of empire, institutions of imperialism. And so it still continues and it erases the plunder and the violence by kind of taking you out of where you are in the world and putting you into a time period, whatever's being displayed, as if the violence from that time period that happened is not continued. And as you said, it skips over even analyzing or looking at the violence. Let's talk about that a little more. So how exactly do museums and other institutions of empire and imperialism erase the history of violence, and only focusing on the aesthetics? How exactly do they do that erasure?
So I think that you described it at the beginning. You enter the museum and you feel unease, right? But on the other hand, we enter the museum because sometimes where we are educated, when we come from, we want to enter the museum because this is a kind of document, in quotation mark, that we receive, that we are educated. And for me, this is a kind of self-reflection on myself. Why did I found myself an art lover when what I was trained to love are capsule of violence, including from what happened to my family, to my ancestors, going back to the 19th century? So I think that there is something about museum that is still considered to be not an institution. I don't know, I was interrupted, sorry. So we still these institutions are still being considered as educational institutions, as institutions that do not practice violence. And when they practice violence, we can correct them, right? We can say that they do not show enough Black women, or they do not show enough women, or they do not do X, Y, or Z. But actually, the institution itself is a formation of violence. And I want to go back to the experience of what does it mean to be in the museum. And when we shot the film, we started by asking permission from the museums to let us in. And of course, we didn't get permission because it's so complicated. It will take you 3 years to get permission. So I decided with my cameraman that we are just entering the museums. And we walk in the museum, and there is a moment when we enter the Cameroon area, and he's from Cameroon, and you would see that it's like a vertigo. His camera turns around in a way that I cannot hold it still. And I think that when we have this uneasiness in the museum, I think that we are speaking about a manifold of emotions that are related to what does it mean to encounter these objects. So yeah, I think, and there is, this strike MoMA these days, right? There are 10 weeks of against MoMA that speak about, it's about abolishing the museum, not about reforming the museum. So museums should be part of what we understand as institutions that should be held accountable and be abolished in continuity with prison abolition and police abolition, etc.
Yes, very, very powerful. I know we only have a few minutes left, so I want to give you all the opportunity to speak to those who viewed your films and anybody who's watching this in the audience. What do you want people to take away from this? What do you want people to take away from you as you show up in this space, from your film, and even this discussion that we're having? Anyone can go. Liz, maybe let's start with you.
Awesome. Thank you. I'd like to thank you, Destiny and Nia and the other panelists. I cannot wait to watch y'all's films. Like, oh my goodness, the brilliance is so real. I would love to invite folks to support Led to Life's work. We are fundraising for the mothers featured in the film, and we work with dozens of mothers who have lost their children and loved ones to police brutality and gun violence. So please move your resources like Black Lives Matter. And I would like to read a brief ritual written by our creative director to guide how we would like you to enter and witness the film. This is not a film. This is a ritual. This is Black queer alchemy. Same way we transform guns, we seek to transform the camera. Liberate the wake of capturing, shooting, taking, developing. This is not to be consumed, tracked, watched, appropriated, surveilled, etc. This is for beholding. This requires your tenderness. We invite you in as a witness to hold these stories with us, to redistribute the grief, and to continue the prophecy. If you have come because your liberation is bound up with ours, Lilla Watson, welcome. Thank you.
Ashe, Ashe. Adrienne, Morel, what about you all?
I want people to take away the thought of considering actions and how this affects our earth, and to think about using their own skills and talent to express these ideas and to share with one another and to think deeply, because sometimes there's some opposites in our life. We eat vegan but do this, or do this and don't do this. So I just want us to all just be conscientious of our actions and in order to help our environment.
And I would say, off of what Adrienne just said, keep the momentum going. Action, holds weight. Words hold weight, and one person can make a change. And sometimes it takes one person to die on that hill to make that change happen. And so with this film, it gives you insight into what we're experiencing here in South Florida, and ultimately is going to be the blueprint for what the rest of the globe is going to experiment when it comes to seawater rise.
Yes, Ariella, what about you?
Yeah, so wow. I hope that people who would see the film, who would watch the film, will understand that there is a lot of unlearning work that is being required. Unlearning assigned settler colonial identities, right? What does it mean to be a U.S. citizen? What does it mean to be an Israeli citizen? These are, settler colonial identities. And I think that through objects, we can not only unlearn these, forcibly assigned identities, but we can practice other identities or other communal identities through a different relationship to objects that, as I said at the beginning, are not always objects, but are part of who we are.
Yes. Lastly, tell everybody how we can stay in touch with you and your work.
Email.
Did you want to give it out, or the website?
Yeah, they're anyhow, advertised somewhere, right? So better they be in our spectators, accessible to spectators rather than to the big brothers in the government.
Yes. Liz, Morel, Adrienne, how can we stay in touch with you and your work?
You can reach me at adriennechadwick.com, and also all my social media handles are Adrienne Chadwick.
Same for me as well. You can find me at moreldoucet.com. And the same thing for Instagram and Facebook.
Awesome. So our website is leadtolife.org. That's LEADTOLIFE. And my email is liz@leadtolife.org. My Instagram is Liz F. Kennedy. And really encouraging folks to move resources. We have a Sabbath trust for the moms. So really encourage, if you're moved by the film, donate, right? We want it to be a practice of reciprocity. And also, I really encourage you to read Lucille Clifton's poem, Won't You Celebrate With Me? I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but you also see in the film, we separate the film into the wakes, the definitions of wakes, and that is a nod to Christina Sharp's work in the wake on Blackness and Being. So would really, really recommend checking out that text if you'd like to learn more about the film as well.
Yes, thank you all. I think, if anything, I can say that all the films touched on many things that we talked about and that we didn't get to. There's films, total, these films might make up more than an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. So it's hard to capture all the beauty and all the intention and hard work that went into it in about an hour discussion. But I really want to thank you all for your attention to detail, for sharing your life, your art, and your work with us. And the connection you all made to the earth, the elements, to our lived experience as art ourselves, as our bodies as art, as our bodies as an environment, and as the objects and creations that we make in art, how they represent us, our community, our lives, and our experience here. It's all so beautiful. And I just thank you all for your time, your energy, your effort, and your work. And everyone at the Black Femme Supremacy Film Festival's team, thank you all for having this panel. Thank you all for featuring this incredible work. And thank you all for having me as your moderator. So to everyone watching and listening, keep up with the festival at bfsfilmfest.com and tune in with us from September 5th through the 11th. Thank you all so much.